They say that life has a way of surprising you at any age. I used to believe that there would come a day when I had everything all figured out, living a quiet and simple routine, free from the cares and demands of youth. But perhaps life isn't that straightforward. There are moments that can jolt us, making us question our understanding of certain concepts. My name is Eileen, and I am 63 years old. After a fulfilling career as a school principal and raising two wonderful children, I thought I knew who I was. My spouse, Neil, passed away 5 years ago. Since then, I've established a life of calm routines, including morning walks, gardening, and keeping in touch with family. I thought I had left excitement and spontaneity behind in my younger days, but something has changed recently in ways that I can't quite fathom. It all began so subtly that I scarcely noticed at first. A lingering gaze, a quiet moment, a connection that seemed innocent enough until it wasn't. My son Adam has a friend named Caleb, who has been an important part of our family for many years. He was like a son to me, someone I had always trusted and respected. But then, in the space of a single day, a stillness settled between us that felt strange, like an unspoken something that neither of us knew how to address. Looking back, it's hard to understand how a lifetime of stability and self-assurance could suddenly feel so fragile and vulnerable to doubt. I keep asking myself what happened that day and why I'm still thinking about it. This is my story. My life has been pleasant, and I've always liked it that way. After over 30 years as a school administrator, I decided to retire, looking forward to some peaceful time. Losing Neil was extremely difficult, but I found strength in my daily routines and the close bond with my children, especially Adam. Adam and I have become even closer since Neil's passing. At 35, Adam is dependable, and Neil and I have always been proud of his responsible nature. Even though he lives alone, he visits frequently and always makes me feel cared for. His presence brings warmth and joy to our quiet home, with his stories and jokes. Caleb, one of Adam's closest friends, has been a regular in our lives since they met in college. At 37, he has built a successful career in engineering. His stability and dedication remind me so much of Neil. Caleb is thoughtful, respectful, and has a quiet, contemplative nature that puts people at ease. I've always felt fortunate to see Adam and Caleb's friendship endure over the years. Caleb's presence in the house brings a different kind of energy, a steady calmness that I truly appreciate. After finishing my gardening one day, I decided to treat myself to a cup of tea and a relaxing day at home. Adam was out of town for a meeting, and the house was unusually quiet. Just as I was about to sit down, I heard a knock on the door. To my surprise, it was Caleb. "Hi, Mrs. Caldwell," he said with his usual pleasant grin. Adam told me he'd be out of town, but I wanted to drop off some books I borrowed from him. I said, "Caleb, it's great to see you. I'm really delighted by this unexpected visit. Come inside if you're not in a hurry. Feel free to stay for tea." He paused for a moment and then nodded. "I'd like that. It's been a while." We settled into the living room once I had a chance to unwind. For the first few minutes, our conversation was light. We talked about work, family, and life in general. But there was something different about the atmosphere. Maybe it was the quietness of the empty house or the relaxed tone of our conversation, but I started to feel an unusual sense of ease around him. As I handed him a cup of tea, our fingers brushed. I didn't think much of it at first, but as we continued talking, I couldn't help but notice that Caleb's gaze lingered on mine for a brief, but detectable moment. That small contact gave me a strange little thrill. I looked up, caught his stare, and suddenly felt self-conscious. "Thank you," I replied. He quickly pulled his hand back, smiling sheepishly. There was a silent moment of mutual discomfort where neither of us knew what to say. It was just a simple gesture, a hand on mine and a moment of uncertainty, but something had changed in that brief instant. I felt a warmth and an awareness between us that I hadn't expected, a connection that seemed to go beyond mere friendliness. I dismissed it as my imagination, convincing myself it was just a momentary lapse, perhaps a result of the stillness of the afternoon. But as we continued chatting, I found myself becoming more and more aware of his presence. I noticed the little things, like the way he leaned forward when I spoke, his quiet laughter, and the warmth in his gaze. It felt as if an invisible line had been drawn between us, something that neither of us acknowledged, but both of us sensed. By the time Caleb left, I was left with an odd feeling, an awareness of him that hadn't been there before. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing, but the memory lingered, leaving me with a strange sense of anticipation and confusion. In the days that followed, I couldn't forget that afternoon with Caleb. Despite my attempts to dismiss it as a simple interaction, the memory of his touch, his gaze, and the quiet intensity in his eyes stayed with me. I felt foolish for even thinking about it, for allowing my mind to wander to unfamiliar places. Caleb was like family to Adam, someone I had watched grow from a college student to a respected professional. But I couldn't deny the small thrill I had felt in his presence, the sense of warmth and comfort that had lingered long after he had left. I wondered if he had felt it too, or if it was just my imagination, a passing feeling brought on by loneliness and nostalgia. I brushed it off, telling myself I was overthinking. Yet the feeling persisted, like an unanswered question at the back of my mind. A week later, Caleb stopped by again, this time to return a book he had borrowed. He seemed relaxed, and I invited him to sit for a while. I felt the same warmth I had felt before, and our conversation flowed easily, ranging from light topics to more personal ones. He told me about his career, his thoughts on moving forward, and the challenges he faced. As he spoke, I felt a sense of pride, like a mother watching her child grow into adulthood. But there was also something else, a growing awareness of the way he looked at me, the attentiveness in his gaze, and the unspoken connection that felt both natural and unsettling. Our conversations became more personal, and with each meeting, I felt the unspoken tension growing. It was subtle, a quiet understanding that neither of us acknowledged, but both of us felt. I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than simple friendship, but deep down, I knew there was something more, a feeling I hadn't expected and didn't quite know how to handle. Over the next few weeks, Caleb's visits became more frequent. Each time he stopped by, I felt a mix of excitement and guilt. I loved his company and looked forward to our chats, as well as the warmth and understanding he brought into my life. But I was also becoming increasingly uneasy. There was a quiet fear that I was going too far, allowing myself to develop feelings that weren't appropriate for our relationship. One evening, as we sat in the living room looking at an old family photo album, I realized just how much I had come to enjoy his presence. We laughed over memories and shared stories, and for a moment, I felt a sense of companionship I hadn't felt in years. But then, as he leaned in to look at a photo, his arm brushed against mine, and my heart raced. It was such a small thing, a simple connection, but the proximity and the warmth of his touch sent a thrill through me that I couldn't ignore. I looked at him, our eyes met, and for a brief second, I felt a connection that went beyond friendship, a quiet, unspoken bond that left me both excited and terrified. I knew I had to stop this, to distance myself before things went any further. Yet each time I tried to convince myself to end our meetings, I felt a pang of regret, a longing for the comfort and warmth he brought to my life. I couldn't deny the loneliness I had felt since Neil's passing, the quiet ache that had become a part of my everyday existence. Caleb's presence filled that void and brought a sense of companionship and understanding that I hadn't realized I needed. And though I knew my feelings were inappropriate, I couldn't bring myself to let go, to close the door on the one connection that made me feel alive. One evening when Adam was still out of town, Caleb came by to drop off some groceries he had picked up for me. I invited him to stay for dinner, and we spent the evening cooking together, laughing, sharing stories, and enjoying each other's company. As the night wore on and our conversation grew quieter and more reflective, Caleb shared his struggles, his loneliness, and the difficulties he faced in balancing his career with his personal life. I listened, feeling a deep sense of empathy and understanding, a connection that went beyond words. At one point, as I was washing dishes, I felt Caleb's hand on my shoulder. It was a light touch, gentle and reassuring, yet it sent a warmth through me that I couldn't ignore. I looked up, meeting his gaze, and in that moment, I saw the same feelings reflected in his eyes, a quiet longing, a depth of emotion. That moment left me speechless. "I don't know," he began, his voice gentle and almost hesitant. "How to say this, Mrs. Caldwell. I sense something between us. I'm not sure what it is, but I can't ignore it." My pulse raced, a mixture of astonishment and panic building within me. I wanted to reject it, dismiss it as insignificant, but I knew it would be a lie. I looked at him, observing the vulnerability in his expression, the same uncertainty and longing that I felt. "For Caleb," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "We can't. This isn't something we can pursue." He nodded, but his hand lingered on my shoulder, a quiet reassurance that spoke of his own confusion. We stood there in silence, both of us grappling with the weight of our emotions and the reality of the boundary we had silently crossed. After a long moment, he stepped back, his expression filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Caldwell. I didn't mean to make you feel that way." "You didn't," I offered him a small smile, acknowledging the complexity of the situation. We finished dinner in silence. The atmosphere was tense, but oddly comforting. I knew that whatever had happened between us was real yet impossible. And though we said little, we both understood that some lines couldn't be crossed, no matter how tempting they might seem. In the weeks following our conversation, Caleb continued to visit, but we approached each encounter with a newfound caution and politeness. We maintained a silent agreement, an unspoken understanding that we would keep our emotions in check, avoiding anything that could be misinterpreted. Our visits, once filled with easygoing laughter and comfortable silences, became carefully orchestrated exchanges. Each of us was keenly aware of the new boundary we had drawn between us. But as much as we tried, the tension was undeniable. A glance, a subtle gesture, the way our conversations sometimes drifted to quieter, more reflective topics, everything felt more intense. Each visit felt like walking a fine line between friendship and something unspoken. I felt as though I was holding my breath, waiting for something to shift again. I found myself wishing for the ease we once had, that uncomplicated friendship that now felt lost in the growing complexity between us. One evening, as we sat in the living room discussing a book we had both recently read, Caleb's hand brushed against mine. The touch was fleeting, a barely noticeable contact, but it sent a jolt through me, a reminder of the feelings I was trying so hard to ignore. I glanced at him, our eyes meeting in a way that felt both tender and charged with meaning. He quickly looked away, but the silence that followed was filled with an unspoken understanding that we were both struggling to maintain our resolve. As much as I tried to remind myself that this was just friendship, I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him, a quiet longing that I knew had no place in my life. I often thought about ending these meetings, of distancing myself entirely, but each time the thought crossed my mind, I felt a pang of regret. I had grown attached to these moments, to the warmth and companionship that Caleb brought, and the idea of letting that go filled me with a sense of loss that I hadn't anticipated. In an effort to create some distance, I started to fill my days with various activities and plans, including joining a local gardening club. I began taking long walks around the neighborhood to prevent my mind from drifting back to those quiet moments with Caleb. However, despite my best efforts, each time he visited, the connection between us remained as strong as ever. One Saturday, we found ourselves alone again, sharing and discussing a topic that had us both laughing. The moment was light, almost carefree, but there was an undercurrent of tension that neither of us could ignore. I saw it in the way his eyes lingered on me and the way his smile softened, as if he too was struggling to keep things light, to ignore the bond that was growing deeper each time we met. The unspoken agreement between us began to feel fragile, as though it could break at any moment. As the weeks passed, I sensed that we were both approaching a critical juncture, where we needed to confront the hidden emotions. There were moments when I would catch him looking at me, his expression unreadable, as though he too was questioning where this path was leading us. And each time, I felt a rush of conflicting emotions, a mixture of excitement, fear, and guilt. I knew that the emotions I was experiencing were dangerous, potentially leading to consequences neither of us had yet desired. Despite the risks, I couldn't bring myself to end it and say the words that would draw a final line between us. The tension between us grew with each passing day, until our meetings became a delicate balance of restraint and quiet longing. We were both holding back, aware of the boundary that neither of us was willing to cross, yet unable to let go of the connection that had brought us so close. It was a complicated and painful feeling, and I often found myself lying awake at night wondering how long we could keep up this delicate dance, how long we could ignore the emotions simmering beneath the surface. But deep down, I knew that this couldn't last. We were both playing with fire, and eventually, one of us would have to pull back, make the difficult decision to let go. And as much as I dreaded that moment, I knew it was coming, a reality that was becoming harder to ignore with each passing day. After several weeks of maintaining this careful balance, I began to feel the weight of guilt more heavily. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was betraying something, betraying Adam's trust, betraying my own values, and perhaps even betraying Caleb in a way by allowing myself to become emotionally attached. I was indulging in something that had no place in our lives, something that could only lead to hurt and regret. Each time I thought of ending our connection, I felt a pang of sadness, a reluctance to let go of the one bond that had brought warmth and meaning to my days. But I knew I couldn't continue like this. I started reflecting on my feelings, trying to understand what had led me to develop such an attachment. Perhaps it was the loneliness I had felt since Neil passed, a quiet ache that had settled into my life without my realizing it. Caleb had filled that void, bringing a sense of companionship and understanding that I hadn't known I was missing. But even as I acknowledged this, I understood that my feelings were inappropriate, and that I was risking far too much for a connection that had no future. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, I decided that it was time to confront my emotions, to understand what I was truly looking for. I realized that while I valued Caleb's presence, it was my own loneliness that had led me down this path. Caleb had simply been the one to fill that void, to provide a sense of comfort in a way that I hadn't expected. Determined to move forward, I resolved to put some distance between us, to create a space that would allow me to let go of the feelings I had developed. It was a painful decision that left me feeling hollow, but I knew it was the right choice. I couldn't continue living with this sense of guilt, this feeling that I was compromising my own values. I needed to find a way to restore my sense of self and heal the loneliness within me without relying on anyone else to do so. The next day, I planned to speak with Caleb and gently explain that we needed to maintain some distance to preserve the boundaries of our friendship and to respect the lives we had both built. Even though it was painful, I knew that this was the only way to find peace. I knew that this was the only way to find peace, and the only way to preserve the integrity of our relationship without crossing a line that would lead to regret. As I prepared for the conversation, I felt a mix of sadness and relief, a sense of closure that allowed me to look at the situation with a clearer mind. I knew this was a necessary step, a decision that would ultimately help me move forward and let go of the feelings that had complicated my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. Even though I knew it would take time, I felt a quiet sense of determination, a belief that I could find my way back to the peace and stability I had once known. Our final conversation was bittersweet, a quiet ending to something that had brought both joy and confusion into my life. When Caleb arrived that evening, I invited him in, feeling the weight of the moment, the sense that this was our goodbye. We sat in the living room, each of us aware of the tension between us and the emotions that had been building over the past few months. I struggled to find the words to express everything I was feeling without hurting him or complicating things further. "Caleb," I began, my voice soft but steady. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about our connection, and I think it's best if we create a bit of space. I've valued our friendship so much, and I don't want to lose that, but I also don't want things to become more complicated." He looked at me, his expression filled with understanding but also sadness. "I understand, Mrs. Caldwell. I never meant to cause any tension or make things difficult." I felt a pang of regret and sadness that I hadn't anticipated. "You haven't done anything wrong." In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life. I threw myself into my gardening, watching as the flowers bloomed and the plants thrived under my care. It was a reminder that life could still be beautiful, even without Caleb's presence. I also started to reach out more to my friends and neighbors. I joined a local book club and a knitting circle. Through these activities, I met new people and formed new connections. I found that sharing my thoughts and experiences with others helped me to feel less alone. Adam noticed the changes in me and was proud of my efforts to move forward. We spent more time together, going on walks and having long conversations. Our relationship grew even stronger, and I was grateful for his love and support. One day, while I was working in the garden, I received a letter from Caleb. I hesitated before opening it, but my curiosity got the better of me. In the letter, he thanked me for the time we had spent together and apologized again for any pain he may have caused. He told me that he was also working on moving forward and that he hoped I was finding happiness. Reading his letter brought back a flood of emotions, but I realized that I no longer felt the same longing I had before. I was content with my life as it was, and I knew that I had made the right decision. As time passed, I continued to heal. I learned to appreciate the simple pleasures in life, like a warm cup of tea on a cold day, or the sound of birds singing in the morning. I also learned to be more in tune with my own emotions and to set healthy boundaries in all of my relationships. My experience with Caleb had been a difficult one, but it had also been a valuable lesson. I emerged from it a stronger and wiser person, ready to face whatever life had in store for me. This story has led us through a complex journey of emotions and relationships. Now, consider these questions. What could Eileen have done differently to avoid developing inappropriate feelings? How can we better handle loneliness in our lives without crossing boundaries? What role does self-awareness play in maintaining healthy relationships? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Let's have a conversation about the power of self-control, the importance of respecting boundaries, and the journey towards emotional well-being.